This is another Bryan podcast. My guest is Eric Sunada. We're going to discuss a lot of heavy subjects recently. Since our last conversation on housing and everything that was happening during COVID-19, still dealing with it today. I think there's things that sound good on paper that came out recently. There's some things that, if we investigated closer, it seems like it's passing the issue further down the line as we were talking in our pre-interview, and some things that are happening in the local area, Alhambra area, the LA area, and maybe some things to consider if how very much important to you. Please check out some of the things that are being done in your community and in the San Gabriel Valley area. There's Everyone In, and Eric, there's Grassroots Alhambra, and another program that you're trying to pilot through, right? There's
Yeah, it's a San Gabriel Valley Oversight Group. That's a
Mhm.
social environmental justice group. And we're also trying to start up a tenants union in Alhambra. So
Mhm.
you'll be hearing more about that in the future, hopefully. Yeah.
Okay, so tennis union and SGV. Sorry,
OG, right. Yeah.
OG.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so just to start off, just recently within the not first couple weeks, but just about a week or so, we just got some news that the Trump administration would grant an eviction moratorium until December 31st, which for a lot of people that sounds like a sigh of relief, but um, literally days ago, another relief plan was not voted on, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be any relief even before the election. So this is just kind of like another situation where it feels like the issue is being pushed over to a group of future people
Right.
post election to deal with. So
Right.
part of why I
Exactly.
brought you on is to kind of talk about what an eviction more means, what is being left on the table in terms of these communities being affected, and extraneous with this extraneous circumstance of coronavirus. And so, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts? What are your thoughts of this
Right.
plan?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. And you're absolutely right that recently the Trump administration put out a eviction moratorium, but like you say, it's just pushing the problem down the road a little bit, both in terms of future administrations to deal with, but also that that moratorium, it prohibits no fault evictions, but it does not give rent relief, right? So
Mm,
people still have to end up paying
yeah.
eventually, and again, it's the structure of the way the housing system is set up, where ultimately it's the landlord, property owner is made whole, that they will get paid, and yet the burden is placed on the tenant, that
Mhm.
without income in the time of COVID, that can be impossible to do. It's impossible to catch up as it is even before COVID. So when that happens, you ask, why is it that the landlord, who is in the business of providing housing,
Mhm.
do they not carry risk? It's a business, and every business has risks associated with it. And yet they're being made whole unquestionably, right? And
Mhm.
that's a problem. And like you say, it pushes it down the road. It sounds good, but it's going to blow up eventually, right? Because people will not be able to make up that pay. And also, at the state level, they also passed a moratorium that's a little different. The federal one, I think it's administered by the CDC, or at least the CDC is giving the guidelines for it, but it's pretty straightforward. The state is a little bit more involved. It's a little bit stronger, but still, it does not give rent relief. They still
Mhm.
have to end up paying. And again, it's debilitating. And, the whole issue about how the the last time we talked, I mentioned about, the commodification of housing, and how housing essentially in that regard is based on, um, is the landlord or developer able to turn a profit, and then housing is distributed to people based on their ability to pay. Um, but the ability to pay is unequal, yet the need for housing is universal, right? So um, that's the system as it stands, and because of that, um, people can't pay equally. They don't have that capacity, so there's going to be people left out, and to change that requires, you're asking the market and investors and landlords to act irrationally to change that, right? Because that's the way it's supposed to work. So, my thought is always that it's basically the basic structure of commodified housing is wrong, and that's what happens. That because of that, every program that is then trying to add relief is always focused on making the landlord, the business owner who's selling housing, whole at the expense of the tenants, right? So that and that can be looked at for even the programs we see today. We have Section 8 housing, right, which is vouchers that gives it to people who basically cannot get into the housing market, rental market, because they just don't have enough income. Well, the government gives Section 8 vouchers to get them into the housing market, to the rental market, so they can have housing. But ultimately, the people who benefit far and beyond is the landlord, right? They're being made whole by getting their full rent. Same with, we always talk about inclusionary housing, and getting a set aside of a new development that's going to be set aside for sold at lower rates.
Hmm.
That too is based on the landlord still going to be able to make a profit, and it's more used as a salve for their conscience, because ultimately this is the commodified business of housing, where ultimately they're obligated to rent for as much as the market will bear, and to extract that money from the most wealthiest customer they can find in order to reduce their risks, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's kind of just like you say, it's putting all the burden down below. And
Yeah. And a similar thing that more or less happened recently is that COVID relief, in terms of what's happening on a federal level, fell through around this week, I believe, and it
right,
wasn't voted upon. And then we can make excuses and certain things
yeah,
about who didn't and who did support it. But I think let's look at it in what would this affect the American individual. And I feel
yeah,
stuff like direct payments for people in a time of something like this, where there's not necessarily an ask of like to pay it back, and it's unconditional, and it really took a burden off of people back when that happened in May, in June. And um and it's unanimous support. Even people from either is saying we should try to do something like this because it releases people from it. Many people now are opening up to this idea of universal basic income, and especially for relief that's not necessarily tied to unemployment. And I've been talking about it for a while in both public and private settings, and I'm thinking it's like, why, if you're so worried about people not to work, then why put relief in something that's existentially like a threat to American society, to something kind of antiquated? And I get it, it's a system that we had before, but does that system make sense for this situation? And
exactly.
and I'm not to say that, oh, like, try to hard support UBI from now until the end of time. It's like, let's, if this was a time to pilot something like a UBI, or like canceling rent or something like that, let's do that here now. Because this is a situation where, if we're trying to tell people to stay at home, there's such thing as a stay at home order, and you don't have a home to go to. It's good if that stay at home order means to that person that does not have a home.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. And I'm also a believer that this is artificial when they say that we cannot afford to help subsidize the people, the working class, the vulnerable and marginalized, and that this is the time to do UBI, and like you say, even if it's not a permanent, at least temporary, it's absolutely needed. Like you say, it's hard to shelter in place when you don't have shelter. And I think that, the Trump administration is, in these times when it's so fractured and it's a crisis level, and he's obviously not doing well because of the way that he handled things. That the one fallback that politicians always do is that housing is political, it's politicized, it's also racialized, and they're falling back on that idea that their base is the wealthy homeowner who views their home as real estate capital for its value, that doesn't want anything to lower its costs, its value, and he will use scare tactics. Recently he repealed the affirmative fair housing program under the Obama administration, using Willie Horton's scare type tactics, right? Rampant crime, and he's actually appealing to the suburban housewife, right? The white suburban housewife. So, even then, he's trying to use housing as a wedge there, and and like you say, with UBI, it's so important because of, obviously, in the time of COVID, but also when you have that ability for some basic income, it can help remove the geographic dependence of housing, right? You don't necessarily have to be at a certain location because your job is in this area. With basic income, perhaps, especially now when we won't be going back to the normal way of commuting, and a lot of people will be working remotely, that you can remove the geographic dependence on housing and go further out, where it's cheaper, where UBI can actually help pay the rent, and and be able to not living under poverty conditions because all your money is going to housing. So yeah, I hear you, and it's like you say, it's again just putting the burden on those who can least afford it, and just pushing the problem down the road. And gosh, it should be going the other way, right? I mean, people should be the people who can work from home, who are doing well. We should be paying more taxes, so to speak, right, during this time, one way or another. So it's going the wrong direction, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like
Yeah.
it's just it's so much burden for like communities that feel like they don't have options, that feel like they don't have the option to stay at home for work. When
Right.
we put I was talking about this with my friend, and we're talking about how it seems scary that it's that, like, you know people will be kicked out of their homes, and like and
Yeah.
their rental apartments and things like that. But I said, like, consider this as like this is a virus that cut people off from their daily source of income. If you've had a job in a retail space, say you're a manager of a Home Depot, or you were working in retail space in a mall, you even own mall space, commercial space, like those things are not paying back to you. They're those aren't of income anymore. And then when you build in a sense where it's like a consumer economy, when all that's taken away, who's going to be filling out paychecks? How
Right.
is people getting money? And when you remove that access towards money, then left. And this is the logic where I'm coming from, in an idea of calling for a universal basic income in some form. That's where I'm coming from. If, like, if we build economy on a consumer basis, and we weigh everything that feeds into a consumer economy, that and there's only one place that can give money, the government.
Right.
and
Yeah.
and this is,
Right.
I hope people don't think this is like a communist
I know.
conversation, but
Yeah.
or
No.
for some radical change. But it's
Yeah. Yeah.
in the frame and the idea that this is an emergency fund. What do you do
Right.
when your car gets into an accident? What do you do when you have an unexpected broken or something that comes up that you need for?
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
tapping those coffers within an organized government and say, like, no, please, the corporation has enough money of their own. We should really focus on getting people to feel whole again. And
Yeah.
I feel like amongst both sides of the aisle, it's like I guess the focus has been so politicized that I don't think within this year anything can be solved. Or maybe I'm just a bit
Yeah.
too pessimistic. Fires that are happening
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
California.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And it's not communistic. It's just is really capitalistic because it like you say, it's really without income. The consumer buying power is so poor and so weak that it can't support this consumer-based economy, right? So
Hmm.
absolutely, it's just a death spiral to the bottom, and it's ridiculous that we can't get the help to the people. And yeah, so I hear you.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of and it goes to the week of the labor, um, and the compensation that's given to labor is so weak already.
mhm.
And Andrew Yang with his UBI had always mentioned a good point that there's so many uncompensated uh, people out there, especially women who are taking care of infants that we see now is just so important, right? And they're
Yeah.
not getting compensated, and this patriarchy is just another reckoning that's being exposed. So yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, and another example of that kind of patriarchy, I guess, uh, given what we're talking about of housing, is that I think recently there was California legislators were voting on I think state bills or Senate bills about housing, and then one legislator had to drive 80 miles with her newborn baby to have to vote on issues on housing. And I think what had
Wow.
happened was that it passed, but I think there was a timeline. So some of these laws or proposed bills are time gated, and if it doesn't
Wow.
get passed during a certain time, according, I think this was on the Colorado Boulevard, if it doesn't get passed in a certain time, it just, even though it had of voting, it's not on the ballot for November.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
And there was several different housing bill that were put to the table that were just kind of it fell through. And I
Yeah.
think given that fires literally got much worse a couple days after, I feel like the news cycle hasn't really picked it up, especially in the local community,
Mm.
and local
Yeah. Yeah.
California news. It hasn't really picked that up. And so this was this was something
Yeah.
that was proposed but
Yeah.
passed. And
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. And speaking of the disappointments at the state level, one that got killed was a bill to allow churches and hospitals to build 100% affordable housing by nonprofit developers, to give them the right to do that without having to comply with city restrictions. And I'm a big believer in that, but it was killed, and it was killed by the labor union, the building trade unions. And I'm so disappointed. I blame both sides, but basically that uh, we can't get. The great thing about the labor unions was their solidarity, class solidarity, is that involved also racial solidarity in terms of inclusiveness,
mhm.
and the fact that they couldn't come to some kind of agreement to stand with class struggle, right? For economic justice for those who needed affordable housing was a real disappointment. That was just, that's a hard one to take.
Yeah, and you would imagine it would open the doors for more people to be in construction industry, and like
Yeah.
be more people in building more houses, communities where empty lots has just been there in generations. There is an empty lot in my in the city I live in that
Mm,
is, it's like maybe 2 or 3 acres of land.
mm, mm,
And it used to be a large dealership, a large used dealership a long time ago.
mm.
And now it's
Okay.
been vacant for almost like a decade and a half. And I was like, this space, if this space was put through the hands of someone that were conscious of the situation that's happening in my city, that could house a considerable amount of teachers, people that live there,
Yeah. Right.
restaurant workers,
Yeah.
people living on the margins that don't live in the that don't work in like a
Yeah.
corporate office.
Exactly. Exactly. It's the and again, it goes back to the way housing structurally is set up this way, where the investors, they will hoard land until they get the best value they can out of it, and they can afford
Hmm.
to keep it. They can afford to keep it vacant, and it's not helping, right?
Hmm.
And so I've always talked about things like it's time to do really some different to get out of this the structural violence that's being put on or marginalized. Is to local government is really important because that's where housing is physically implemented, and they have to do things like do eminent domain on such things or tax the hell out of them for keeping things vacant like that because it's not serving the people, right? Exactly. It's just so
Yeah, and going to that local conversation, I haven't really dived too much into what's been happening in Alhambra, but you did mention that there was this development in Fremont that was
yeah,
being that was a whole controversy. Like even
yeah,
the candidates for city council came out on a protest
right,
near City Hall to talk
right,
about what was happening in that area.
yeah,
But
yeah,
do you know
yeah,
much about what's going on
yeah,
in Alhambra?
yeah, yeah, sure. Well, on that project, it's become symbolic also because it is the largest infill development in the city's history and likely to be the
Hmm.
largest ever. It's over 1,000 units, and and the reason why it's so controversial as well. I mean, going down another level is that the way it was formulated and approved, um, it is like the poster child for hyper commodification of housing as well as co-optation of real estate onto local government. And
Hmm.
so, this is a plot of land that was uh, initially zoned for office only, and it sits upon a Superfund site, which is the federal designation for serious contamination, in this case, groundwater, and
Hmm.
we also have soil contamination. So, they bought the land under those circumstances, and of course, the land is discounted because of that. But overnight, almost that land value was increased tremendously under this owner because the city council passed a spot zone that allowed them to build um, at the highest density of at the city allows. So in other words, they went from being able to build no housing to being able to build a tremendous amount of housing there
Hmm.
without asking for any return to the community, like affordable housing. So
Hmm.
they basically gave up this huge bonus in density without getting any affordable housing in return. But it gets worse than that because the mayor under which this zoning change was given um, is now a consultant for this developer, and he has unprecedented access to City Hall to the point where he can help ghostwrite letters from the mayor in support of this development. He choreographs city council meetings with
Hmm.
staff and the developer, and so and to me, it's important because that's recognized, and now it's time to see. Well, we should really get something in return to the community, affordable housing, but and that was that was made known to the developer that that was a serious consideration, and they came back with a really something that's just a non-starter. It was a 5% set aside of the units is affordable at the moderate rate. And the problem with that is that moderate um, is basically defined as 120 up to 120% of the median income for a household in the area, metropolitan area. Now, that number that we are judged against is $77,000 a year for income. So 120% of that is considered, they're considering it affordable housing. And, but the fact is that in Alhambra, our corresponding median income is only $57,000. So it's doubly regressive to go, it's already regressive to, judge affordability against the area median income, but it's doubly regressive when our income is so far below that in which we're judged. So it's essentially no affordable housing being offered, and and so it's insulting. And at the same time, there's a lot of reaction to it as well, from the point of view that it's affecting people's quality of life and the environment. It's adding traffic. It's one of the most polluted areas of the city. My opinion though is that that you must, any public official or community group that looks at the entire city cannot just categorically say no to this development. You have to see what can it do to help address the ills, what can be done to be better. If it just can't be done, then how else can we solve the problem, the housing crisis here that we have a serious problem with? So it's and it's one of those things where housing, from the regard of being not only shelter, which gives you the ontological security, the peace of mind that allows you to then have your social circle to be creative. Your creative powers are unleashed when you do have that security. But housing, in terms of being that is something that is lived and is universally needed, and it is your social dimension. That must be defended. But what does not need to be defended is housing when seen as a piece of real estate, as a way to become rich, right? So we have a lot of people who residents, single family homeowners, who would oppose this project because it may they feel it may lessen their property values, creating more traffic, things like that. Or and from that regard, I don't see that as being defensible, right? So it's one of those things where it's all these things come into play, and it's really great to have this conversation during these times.
I to give individuals that don't live in Alhambra some context. So it's called the Villages at the Alhambra, and
Right.
so what you mentioned, this used to be a business area. This is also used to be an area where I took my GMAT at one point.
Oh.
But and there used to be a for-profit college that was in there that was operating at one point, and it would develop the area, and for another thing on top of that, to describe what a Superfund site in deeper terms is, that I think the U.S. government, in terms of the EPA, was it through the EPA?
Correct, EPA, right.
The Environmental Protection Act, categorize certain areas of the United States as places where there needs to be more investment to be put in for it to be cleaned up. So large swaths of places in LA like Burbank and Glendale that used to do a lot of chrome for automobiles, and a lot of airplane manufacturing used to be in that area. If you learn anything of California history, a lot of aviation used to be in that area. And some still do. In that area of Alhambra specifically is closest to the railroads. There's a steel mill, I believe, that still operates there.
Yeah, I think they moved it to Texas not a few years ago. But
Yeah,
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 right,
and now there's swaths of land that are now available for development. So like
right,
not
right.
just the villages in that area, that's block of land. There is I think something of that that's been all torn down recently and
Right,
leveled.
right.
So
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
this
Yeah,
is a context we're living in.
yeah, exactly. And and clearly, that toxic vapor, toxic vapors are emanating from that site, and they must be, no question, they must be remediated and mitigated before anything can be built. And I'm
Hmm.
hoping the developer agrees to that, of course. But that 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 has to happen. But
Yeah.
and then there's these other issues also of yeah, of housing, and the fact that the majority partner in this development is a wealth management firm from overseas,
Hmm.
again, whose job is to sell units at the highest price the market will bear from the most wealthiest customers, right? So,
Yeah.
and people say, well, that doesn't cause displacement because people are, this is new housing, where none existed before, but really it does. It it ratchets it up when you target entirely the upper classes. That when you do that, and you seek out the most wealthy buyers, of course that's going to change the demographics in the city.
Yeah,
And
and a community.
right,
I've read before, like through Vice, that areas that really gentrified, like places like in London,
yeah,
where they built these luxury apartments and these communities that their medium income is way higher than the working class individuals that used to live there.
yeah,
And the places like those are just ghost towns, like
yeah,
whenever weather is bad, they decide, you know what, I already have a property in a separate country. I could just go there, better weather, and don't need to deal with, um, I
yeah.
guess, England in the winter.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. You're exactly right. It's amazing how these luxury areas are so serenely quiet and um, and peaceful, and
Hmm.
people are gone. Like you say, some of the housing you hit it right on. London is kind of ground zero for gentrification, right? So um, there are luxury units there that are built specifically for investments, not necessarily for living. And it's amazing. You look at some of these floor plans, and
Hmm.
they won't even actually have a a working type kitchen, right? Because it's meant for as a showpiece type thing. And they also have where a lot of the countries themselves, the government will put on or investment firms will bundle these things and sell them globally on the global market for
Yeah.
investors, right? So it's like, oh, it's getting pretty far away from housing as shelter, and you know um, providing your security and your social being. Um, in other words, I see housing as something that tries to get you shielded from the pressures of economics, right? That tries to give you the peace of mind, as opposed to the way real estate looks at housing as all about money, all about
Hmm.
economics, right? So um, until we change that, I think we're just doing tweaks to the system that even the villages at the Alhambra that you talk about, there's a lot of talk about tweaks in terms of density or building height, things like that, which are important. But to be honest, it's working within the system still that is broken,
Yeah.
and they need more drastic changes.
Yeah, and what you mentioned earlier, and then I just want to confirm what I was just hearing is that there's people that work within the city council, also intimately tied to the development. Also, how
It
is that
was
not a conflict of interest?
yeah, it was previous city council mayor, so the former mayor who then terms out, right,
Okay.
who then is a consultant for the developer, but has really unethical access allowed
Mm-hmm.
to the city local government, the staff, choreographing meetings and ghostwriting letters for the mayor in support of the development, and that's factual. We that was on a public records request that
Mm-hmm.
was confirmed, and the previous city manager who left had apologized for that. But um, that's that apology doesn't do much when a
When
lot
the
of
work
people.
is already done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So it's really yeah, it's quite symbolic, and there's a lot of you know, class issues, race issues. Housing is politicized, and it's being used that way for sure. So
Yeah. And in terms of people that are listening to this podcast, it's not necessarily private tenant owners or people that are using, say, their grandparents' home as a way to gain personal income. These are large financial corporations that are making large decisions on communities such as ours.
right,
Like and it's not to say that they shouldn't develop, because development shouldn't necessarily be seen as a negative, but we should really focus in on how this development is being used towards the community.
right,
If
exactly.
it's being made, like you said, um with a median income in mind of $70,000 a year, like
Yeah,
what yeah, $70,000 a year.
yeah,
Like we should really consider, like, why are we building these so-called luxury apartments in an area where the median income does not meet that requirement? That
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And that was only for the 5% that they considered affordable. Most of them will go for incomes well above that it can only
Yeah.
afford them. We're talking $700,000, $800,000 for a condo, right? That you need much higher income for that, and it's yeah. And so that's a good question, right? And the problem with the city local government, um, when it is co-opted by real estate to this
Hmm.
degree, it's combined with the private advocacy that the developers can do with their
Yeah.
public relations firms and things like that. um, it's almost impossible for any sort of public participatory planning in this type of stuff. And yeah, so to me, it's we're treating the symptoms in a lot of the cases instead of the cause, because the cause is at the root that requires drastic changes in how housing is handled, not just here, but in general in the United States. So um, yeah,
Yeah. And the movement and like the hyper focus on suburban areas. And we were talking about this earlier, and I'm moving to a conversation about the affected fire areas such as Paradise of last year, and now this year we're dealing with I believe it's called the Cable Fire in Central California, like where Sequoia is. I
oh,
need to double check if I'm right.
okay,
But the fires around that area, and the fire that we're dealing right now in the San Bernardino area, and in the Bobcat Fire area of the San Gabriel Mountains,
yeah, yep, yep,
um, where we're we're constantly having this perception and this idea that the American dream, the white picket fence and like a
hmm,
house and 2.5 kids and a dog,
hmm,
um, that can only be sustainable for so long.
yeah,
And what I'm
right,
trying to get at is that we're pushing into areas where not necessarily a lot of people are moving into before, like a lot of these
right,
forested areas. and
yeah,
and if, say, for instance, this current administration gets its way, more of those national parks will be used as
hmm,
to gather resources or build developments in the hopes of getting more people into those
yeah, yeah, exactly. A lot of yeah, building on unsustainable areas, building on floodplains that later get flooded, with
areas.
global warming, like you say, in fire zones. And um, and one of the things about that, that a lot of people see that plays into that also is that there's a group general mindset that the solution to the housing crisis is also you just have to build more. It's simply an economic problem where you just have to give more supply to the demand type of thing.
Right.
And but in other words, growth at all costs. But the one thing where I see that it can help both in terms of being more effective housing as well as not just doing growth at all costs is to think about addressing the unaffordability of housing and doing more to do public housing that is 100% affordable.
Mm-hmm.
Because my belief is that there's no shortage of unaffordable housing because the market sees to that, and it's just the unaffordable housing. And to be able to do that would help to try to minimize that growth that has to extend into those unsustainable areas, as well as addressing the people who need housing the most.
And to throw a real monkey wrench into that whole idea that build it and they will come, sort of mentality. It's like, consider what happened in areas of China where they build these massive city development. Like, it's not just a development, like for example, the villages at Alhambra. No, these are actual cities being torn down and built up. And like, that hasn't worked out for that country. If you have this current philosophy of build it and they will come, that can also be unsustainable. And especially if we're thinking, and you brought this up many times, even if you're thinking in terms of let's make all these expensive housing and like these rental properties where we're trying to target a certain income bracket, that can't be sustainable if down the line maybe those jobs don't exist. Maybe the careers where you spent your whole life training towards is non-existent.
That's a good point.
So what to do there? And so and I think we can both agree is that how as a community we can be measured and be tactful and not think that, oh, this blanket solution is going to be the magic bullet. And there's no such thing as a magic bullet. And as much as a lot of people like to that specific conspiracy, there's no such thing as a magic bullet. There's no one thing that can solve all our problems. And what works from one place to another may not be the same fit. And I've mentioned this a lot before. And adding that other wrench of more national disasters are happening and more flooding, and apparently Colorado had 8 inches of snow in September. So it's like, how are we going to maneuver ourselves so we could get a better future and not have something like this to be a politicized thing. And when I was growing up, I thought, oh, everybody had a home, But as an adult, I'm starting to learn more and more that even if you had a computer development job in Silicon Valley, you might as well be living in a car park with other computer developers because you can't afford the rent in Silicon Valley.
Exactly. It's like the the people who feel that the housing crisis is also just a limited number of cases where it's just the mentally ill or the immigrants or the indigent or the single parent household type thing. And in other words, they blame the victim, or at best, they're just saying that it neglects the structural problems behind it, and it's just blaming the victim. So it's one of those things where I think you have to have a totally different mindset, totally different view of housing, and totally different view of the climate, right? Like we're not
Mm-hmm.
doing enough to turn it around. And if we don't take those drastic moves, it's I think a lot of people are trying to fight within the system, just so to speak. They're trying to just get a room on a higher deck of a sinking ship, right?
Yeah.
So it's just you got to have some, and we need leaders who have the courage to fight for that, and we have some of them out there,
Mm-hmm.
and just trying to get the political will of others to see to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and in situation like I haven't mentioned this before with you, but I was just learning about the Jose Huizar sort of
Mm,
situation in the LA County area and corruption happening in government where you know um what you mentioned earlier was like that sounds like a conflict of interest if that person is still in office, but
yeah.
that is a issue of itself. But when a council member is being basically a pay to play sort of situation
Right.
with the city, and the investors and funders are giving him exorbitant amount of money to basically say, hey, give me priority to build on this city,
Right.
and there's nothing given back to a community. And I'm not to say that that system can be used. And I'm absolutely saying right now that it probably won't be the best way to get affordable housing if
Right. That's right. Yeah. Right.
generally
Exactly.
their intentions are it's not affordable.
Right. Exactly.
so
Right. Right. Right.
so
And when,
it's
yeah. Right.
yeah, it's that dual thing of having elected officials be creative in bringing new ideas to the tables, and like we mentioned earlier with UBI and canceling rent, having them being put to the table, and the other thing is like having fair and balanced investigations when communities members are being bad faith actors, taking bribes, putting people we're putting people such as investors above people that live in the community.
Hmm.
Sorry about
Hmm.
that. I
Right.
just wanted to
Right.
make my point.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I agree. And yeah, it's one of those things that, like you say, there's no silver bullet either. Um, but even then, some of the bullets that are needed are pretty extreme, but it's needed. And
Mhm.
without it, it's a sinking ship. So, yeah.
Yeah, it there's if it's a conversation sounds like we're being battered, it's like we've been living through coronavirus a little bit long, and
Yeah.
this issue has been an issue for a long time, even prior to COVID. We've worked together
Right.
on certain things already.
Right. Exactly.
That
Exactly.
like the idea of housing, and especially in terms of what's been going on in California, is that if you live as a police officer or you live as a public server like a fire
Hmm.
department person or a firefighter or a teacher, you can't
Hmm.
necessarily live in the areas where you can effectively do your work.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And
Right.
when
Yeah.
you have situations where literally people have to commute hours,
Hmm.
even on public transportation to get to their school district, I
Yep.
think as a community you should start to consider, it's like, why do we have this system where we feel like people have to do that?
Right. Exactly. And I argue that it's structurally set up that way, right? Where
Hmm.
and people use it to define class. It's the ugly side of the housing system as we know it today, where it's used as a cudgel to enforce class structures, racial discriminators, and class inequality. It's used that way, and it's politicized that way,
Hmm.
and um, and it's a club where they get people unknowingly sometimes to join that club by saying that it's the right thing to do for the young family to buy a house and to stretch your savings as much as possible just to buy the house. And once they're locked in, they realize that their entire net worth is locked up in their house, and they have to protect that investment like their life depended on it. And
Hmm.
they will fight anything that threatens its value, including the possibility of building affordable housing down the street or something,
Mm-hmm.
and they become part of that machine, and they're politicized, and um, that's what we have to get around, and that's something that I mentioned, that is not worth defending. It's housing as the universally necessary and lived reality that gives your social dimension, and your security, that allows you to be creative, and that's what needs to be defended. And it's a big
Mm-hmm.
difference between housing as seen as purely real estate investment versus a human right for shelter. So yeah.
Yeah, and my hope is that, I guess, in communities such as, Temple City, as we mentioned before, places that use the tactic of fear mongering,
Right.
the ideas of affordable housing, and housing where it comes from an old, like
Yeah. Right.
80s, and this idea that, oh, it's you're just gonna build a project. So, like, no, like, I've seen these buildings, and like, you could go to El Monte, where
Yeah.
they just
Right.
finished a whole track of veteran housing, to
uh,
house at-risk veterans. You could look at those buildings and say, oh, this looks like, just another
mm,
apartment area that, you know
yep.
wouldn't look out of place in, say, Irvine, that
Hmm.
has similar looking housing to something like this,
Hmm. Yep.
and I see
Yep.
that, and I see areas of LA that, does feed into those fears. It's like, well, what can we do to help help those communities too,
Yeah. Right.
housing
Exactly.
that's been dated back into the 80s and into the 70s. How can we, you know
Yeah.
properly either renovate or build new,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to help
Right.
people
Yep.
just live. And I
Right.
think, if we talk about housing in a human way, and you said this before, it's jumpstart creativity, and it helps jumpstart a peace of mind, and and you
Yeah.
feel that you have a place to return to.
Right.
So
Exactly.
I just
Yeah.
hope that there's a mindset change.
Yeah, I hope so too. And and you and I have both worked to try to address the Asian paradox here, where we have a lot of struggling Asians and Asian Americans here, who, on the other hand, can be some of the most vocal fighters of affordable housing, right? And tend to stigmatize sometimes that element, and are susceptible to falling for this idea of, you know, it's a crime-ridden thing when you build affordable housing, and and trying to change that, and that that it's both um, scarcity that the market uses to increase prices, as well as scarcity of time that our most vulnerable have, that
Yeah.
they make bad decisions sometimes. And it's just yeah. And when not most of your income is going to housing, you actually have money to actually live, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing how cities can be transformed, especially in these areas of really declining retail and business areas that just don't have the people walking the neighborhoods. And when you have affordable housing there, and by definition, people are limited to spending only 1/3 of their income on housing, they actually have money to patronize the restaurants and to the
Mm-hmm.
stronger consumer buying power. So um, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Right.
going back to the Asian American conversation, is that, I live on two separate ends of it, and where the statistic lies. You're of an East Asian background, Japanese American.
Right.
I am a Cambodian American, of a Southeast Asian graphic. You know, if we have this conversation of, like, this model minority myth, which we mentioned before
Mhm.
at the tail end of our last conversation, is that, it doesn't necessarily tell you the full picture of what each Asian American group is going through. You know, East
That's
Asians
right.
tend
Yeah.
to have the higher end of the economic spectrum. The jobs,
Right.
and
Right.
as seen as, like, the more wealthier, and in terms of on the Southeast Asian and situations, like we're seen as not necessarily having the capital to do so,
Yeah.
having
Right.
to own, be if we want to get out of that, that's that we're not contributing members of society, we have to own businesses, and then have to hustle. And I had where a family member worked and worked and then realized, wait a minute, I'm working all the time. It's like I haven't had a vacation in a while, and so that quality of life, they had to realize, we made our fortune, we've gotten to a place where we feel good. Let's just have a vacation, and so some communities feel that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, and you're absolutely right that there's differences between the Asian and Asian American groups here, and there's differences, and there's certainly, the Southeast Asians uh, are, are are having a rough time, a lot of them, and
Hmm.
it's also that there's different levels of structural things working against them, like people who have to start their own business and try to stretch to make a living, and hopefully they're successful. Some of that is structural, and that shouldn't have happened. They should have had an easier time, right? But
Hmm.
because of that, they're forced to do that. And the history, you have to look at the history behind each of these groups and the level of colonization that they experienced, right? Like the indigenous here, and um, to identify with that, and that's part of it also. And you're right, and there's different degrees of what's happened, the structural violence against the different groups, and the ultimate is the African American, the blacks, right, who have unprecedented structural violence against them in this country, right, in terms of colonization and just what they've been through, and that's something that is just on a different plane in my regard. And so but yeah, and I think that, though, one thing is that we there is also an overriding thing about the category of white supremacists, right? The white supremacy is something that uh, that more people can form coalition to get behind, to fight against. And because even, like you mentioned, Japanese Americans, that they've a lot of them have, they're all about upward mobility, and they're all about making money and all that stuff, and some of them have been very successful, um, and they need to realize that a lot of times they're being fooled, or being used to keep down other people of color, right? There's,
Yeah.
like, add to the model minority trope, and they're being said that, oh, you're white also, so and you're great, you did it the right way, which is such bullshit, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
I feel like,
yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah,
Sorry.
I was gonna say, it's like, I remember watching that PBS documentary with a family member of mine, and they were saying, um I don't necessarily think it was presented in the best way for a
Oh,
non-English speaking person, but it's like, oh, after the social ills of World War II, and Chinese exclusion that went away,
yeah,
they got basically a East Asian mom that was a single mom, worked
yeah,
hard, got her kids through college and things like that, and put her on a pedestal. Like, she was literally in parades
right,
or
right,
throughout the United States, saying that, oh,
right,
this is the epitome of the Asian American dream, or
right,
the
right,
American
right,
dream, and
yeah,
basically saying to other minority groups, and it's like, oh, if the Asian can do it, then you can do it.
yeah, yeah,
What's putting you back?
exactly,
And like cattle prodding, it's like, hey, why, like, not really, suggesting that
yeah,
there's been
yeah,
a
yeah,
structural problem here, but
yeah,
with
yeah,
that family
yeah,
member, they just
exactly,
thought, oh, like,
yeah,
went through this whole horrific thing of like the Khmer Rouge and stuff like that, and like,
I know,
all they had was just camps. It's like, no, I'm like, no,
right,
listen, still went through a similar
yeah,
thing. They lost their property, they
yeah,
lost their livelihoods, they
yeah,
still
right,
did
right,
not have, they weren't made whole again after that, like,
yeah,
still consider
exactly,
the contents of what happened to this group of people that lived in America,
hmm
like, first generation, second generation, third
Yep.
generation,
Right. Exactly.
um
Yeah. Yep.
yeah.
Right. I think she was mom of the year or something like that, right? And she put up on the pedestal and paraded around, and yeah, it's just really
And there's
and
no
I,
deeper
yeah,
conversation of like how to fix the issues of poverty, and like and because
right,
that's something that wasn't necessarily taught in history.
yeah,
We're not really having intense conversations of how to fix these things, these
right,
issues.
yeah,
And now I'm gonna have a separate
okay,
podcast on with educators, is that now it's being under fire, talking about race and talking about the ills of what happened in the United States throughout its own
mhm.
history. That is seen American. I'm like, wait, what's going on? I'm just like, basically more than half of what I learned in college and the work I do is now going to be illegal. Is that what's
uh,
happening? Talking about race and critical race theory, like,
uh,
what's happening here?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's yeah, and the whole thing about using Asians fighting against affirmative action, which to me is crazy. That again, being used to keep other people of color down. And I have been happy to see the Asian American community coming behind the Black Lives Matter movement.
Hmm.
And there's been some good groups there working to help there, which is good. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's a tough one.
All right. Well, I feel like we've had a catharsis for an hour.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
we had a
It's
moment to
almost,
talk about a lot of
yeah,
very heavy subjects, and
yeah.
something to keep in mind. Like the elections are coming up in November,
All right,
and
right.
regardless on who you vote for, who you support, I would say please vote. And also at the same point, make if issues such as these, like housing, if these are important to you, you as a citizen, as long as you feel like you're comfortable, like go out, talk to people in your community and say, like, listen, this is what we need.
Hmm.
And I'm not trying to force people to be politicians or anything. It's just there's a level of people that should be conscious of, you know if you live in a community, you should speak up if something that you see that you want, like, say for an instance, affordable housing. So your friend as a teacher that feel like they can't work in a public school anymore and have to end up working in a private school in a further distance, or in a different public school in a different city, like they can be heard,
Right.
and
Especially at the local level, where things like that are physically implemented, and it really matters. Which is why it is so important for people, like you say, to let their concerns be known and to voice them to your local government.
mhm,
And it's all, on the other hand, it's also, it can be some of the most damaging things can happen when you have the as MLK had stated before, was that the bigger threat to progress, more so than the KKK or white supremacists, is the moderate liberal who is a gradualist who isn't willing to make changes when it comes to their own neighborhood, their own backyard,
mm,
right? So um, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
it's
Yeah. I think I mentioned this before with my last guest from the University of Denver.
mm,
We had a collective frustration about, with this current vice no no the Biden and Harris ticket, and how much it seems like it's the most moderate thing to be put on the table.
mhm,
And I said, if you're frustrated through police brutality and Black Lives Matter, it's like, and if this current administration is an existential threat, it's like, yeah, just vote with who you want to vote for, but also put their feet to the fire,
mhm.
as we mentioned
Absolutely.
before. If things aren't being done, it's like, don't feel like you have to give up if you don't get your way. Just like local communities, local
Mhm.
governments,
Right.
mayor's office, council offices, just say like, listen, this is what we value in a community. Get like a coalition together, get like a group of
Mhm.
people to say, hey, like, have you realized that affordable housing doesn't look like a project?
Right.
You know,
Right. Yep.
take your city council on these trips to say like, oh, this is what it looks like, this
Right.
is the reality of affordable housing.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. That's right. So, yeah, like you say, try to pull them in the direction, like, the Biden Harris, there's a chance that they can be pulled a little bit to the left, right? So hopefully that can happen, and they can make some changes that we need. But yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Anyway, so thanks for listening. Is there
Okay.
anything else you want to plug?
No.
The project for the San Gabriel Valley organizing,
Um, yeah.
or
So yeah, a group of people are starting up Alhambra Tenants Union
mm-hmm,
to help with tenants' rights. 62 to 60, about 62% of the households in Alhambra are renters,
mm-hmm,
and yet they encompass most of the lower income groups. So, um, yeah. And we don't have rent control or anything like that in the city. So
mm-hmm.
that's something that's worth fighting for. And but yeah,
Real,
like, yeah. Go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say real quick. Explain what a tenant union does for a community, just like a real quick one.
Yeah, so it basically advocates for policy changes, to help protect tenants, renters, but also it can do more tactical things like the short-term eviction defense,
Mm-hmm,
where a whole building's getting evicted because the owner wants to kick people out because they can make more money with condos or something like that. And trying to come up to the defense of those people and helping their voices to be heard, um, and getting resources to them, legal resources, things like that. So um, yeah, in a nutshell.
all right, so Alhambra Tenant Union. I'll go ahead and if there's any link or literature, just send it my way, and then I'll let folks check it out.
Yeah,
Um,
it's it. Yeah, I'm a participator. I'm not a leader in it, but I'm definitely participating and helping, and I'm a big
mhm.
advocate for it. So yeah, good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for sitting down on
Yep.
this conversation of housing.
Yeah.
Not a lot of, I wouldn't say it's not positive, but I feel like this
Yeah.
conversation
Has to happen.
has to happen,
Yeah. Yeah.
given our circumstances in
Right.
this current
Exactly.
situation. So I hope
Exactly.
you all enjoyed our podcast, and I hope you subscribe and check us out later.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.